Imagine a city where the only sound is the wind whistling through empty streets. This is Constantinople, the jewel of the world. But the air is thick with a sweet, rotting stench that clings to the back of your throat. Towers of bodies lie stacked in the open, waiting for burial pits that can't be dug fast enough. The living hide behind barred doors, listening not for invaders, but for the telltale swellings on their loved ones' bodies. The buboes. This isn't a war zone, it's a tomb. Official records call this a pestilence, a trial from God. But newly analyzed evidence, hidden in the bones of the dead for 1,500 years, tells a much more terrifying and microscopic story. What you think you know about the Roman Empire is about to be rewritten in blood. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. Before the silence, there was sound. Before the rot and the sweet stench of decay, Constantinople pulsed with the noise of a world being remade. To understand the horror that was coming, you have to first see the dream that it would destroy. This was the city of Emperor Justinian, a man born of peasant stock who now sat on the throne of the Caesars, and beside him, the Empress Theodora, a former actress whose will was forged in the city's gutters. Together, they shared a single, magnificent, and utterly dangerous obsession: Renovatio imperii, the renewal of the Roman Empire. Not just the East, which they held, but the West, the lost heartlands of Italy, Africa, and Spain. All to be brought back under the eagle's wing. It was a dream so audacious it bordered on madness. And to make it real, Justinian would remake the world's greatest city in his own image. His court historian, Procopius, meticulously documented it in a book called Buildings, and it reads like a blueprint for divinity. Imagine standing on the shores of the Bosphorus as the first colossal Hagia Sophia rises, its dome, a man-made heaven of gold mosaic, reflecting a light so brilliant it hurt to look at. Hear the clang of 1,000 hammers on marble as new palaces, forums, and triumphant columns tear through the old city. Feel the splash of clean water on your face from aqueducts stretching for miles. A miracle of engineering that quenched the thirst of 500,000 souls. This was the center of the universe, a city dripping with wealth and divine right. But this golden age was built on a knife's edge. Look closely at the faces in the mosaics from this time. You can see the ambition, the piety, the power. But what you can't see is the paranoia festering just beneath the surface, the crushing taxes levied to pay for it all, and the deep, tribal hatreds that divided the city's people. And in the heart of this perfect city, a riot is about to be born from the roar of a crowd at the chariot races. That roar came from the Hippodrome, a colossal stone amphitheater that was the beating heart and bleeding ulcer of Constantinople. This wasn't just a place for sport. It was the only place where the common man could voice his fury directly to the emperor. The city was divided into factions, the blues and the greens. Think of them less as sports fans and more as sprawling, politically charged street gangs, each with their own militia, influence, and a bottomless hatred for the other. Justinian, a blue supporter himself, had tried to crush the greens, creating a tinderbox of resentment. In January of 532 AD, a spark ignited it all. After the arrest and botched execution of members from both factions, the unthinkable happened. The raw animal hatred the blues and greens had for each other was suddenly eclipsed by their shared hatred for the regime. In the middle of the races, the crowd's competing chants died down, replaced by a single, terrifying, unified roar that echoed off the marble walls and struck fear into the heart of the palace. Nika! 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 Victory! It was the password for a revolution. The mob surged from the Hippodrome, and the city that was a monument to Justinian's ego became his funeral pyre. The air, once filled with the scent of incense and sea salt, turned thick and black with the smoke of burning buildings. That brand new, glorious Hagia Sophia, they torched it. The fires raged for days, a physical manifestation of the people's hate. Now, the official history, the one written by Justinian's man Procopius, tells a story of a terrified emperor packing his treasure and ready to flee for his life until Empress Theodora shamed him into staying, declaring that purple is the noblest shroud. It's a great story, but what if it isn't the whole truth? Another chronicler, John Malalas, tells a different tale, one of a more proactive emperor trying to negotiate, facing the mob himself. Why the difference? Perhaps because Procopius's version makes the man who did save Justinian seem all the more necessary, all the more heroic. With the city burning and the army in hiding, the emperor was a prisoner on his own throne. And the question wasn't if the regime would fall, but how many hours it had left. The solution to Justinian's problem wasn't found in negotiation. It was found in a man. His name was Belisarius. He was the emperor's general, a weapon forged on the savage eastern frontier in the wars against the Persian Empire. While the politicians and nobles were cowering in the palace, Belisarius possessed an unflinching loyalty and a genius for cold, lethal efficiency. He was the answer. He and his fellow general, Mundus, were given the order. The plan was simple, brutal, and drenched in duplicity. The leaders of the riot were promised a new round of negotiations, a potential pardon, and they were told to gather their followers back where it all began, the Hippodrome. The desperate, exhausted, and hopeful mob flooded back into the great arena, believing they had won. They were fools. Once they were inside, the gates were barred, the exits were sealed. The crowd's cheers of victory likely turned to murmurs of confusion, and then to a rising tide of panic as they saw Belisarius's heavily armored troops taking up positions at every entrance, their shields locked, their spears leveled. The city's great stage was about to become its abattoir. Procopius, the same historian who watched the city burn, tells us what happened next. He doesn't flinch. Belisarius and his men began the slaughter. This wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. The unarmed mob was trapped, a wave of human flesh broken against a wall of iron discipline. By the time the screams died down and the blood began to cool on the sand of the arena, an estimated 30,000 people were dead. The riots were over. The city was silent. This is the man Justinian would send to reconquer Rome. A man who saved the city by slaughtering its citizens. Ask yourself, was this the act of a hero or a monster? That same cold, lethal efficiency that slaughtered 30,000 citizens was the very bedrock of Justinian's empire. It wasn't just a human weapon. It was built into the stone and mortar of the frontiers. To see the true scale of Roman power, you have to leave the glittering capital and travel east to the dusty, searing hot border with the Persian Empire. The superpower of the day. Here, on a godforsaken stretch of rock and sand, Justinian built the fortress city of Dara. This wasn't just a fort, it was a statement, a permanent middle finger to the Persian Shah. And the details of its construction, again documented by Procopius, are frankly unbelievable. He tells us the main walls were raised to 60 feet. That's a 6-story building rising out of the desert floor. The towers that punctuated them soared to 100 feet, 10 stories. From their ramparts, you could see deep into enemy territory. But the real genius was hidden underground. To survive a siege, you need water, and the engineers at Dara performed a miracle. They dug out massive underground cisterns, reservoirs to hold rainwater. You've probably seen pictures of the famous Basilica cistern in Constantinople, a stunning underground forest of columns. The cisterns at Dara were even bigger, and records show one was nearly 20 feet deeper. They even rerouted the local river to flow through a channel under the city, providing a constant source of fresh water while remaining completely inaccessible to an enemy. Now, you're probably thinking these numbers sound like exaggerations, propaganda to impress a rival empire. But modern archaeological surveys at the Turkish site have verified Procopius's account. This wasn't propaganda. This was the physical reality of Roman power. This was the machine, the steel and stone and water and discipline that Justinian would hand over to his butcher, Belisarius. With the city pacified and the eastern frontier secure, the emperor turned his gaze west to the lost provinces. The dream of reconquest was about to begin, but it wouldn't be a glorious crusade. It would be a long, dirty, grinding war that would break a kingdom and bleed a peninsula dry. With the machine of war perfected and the capital brought to heel, Justinian finally unleashed his butcher on the west. The target was Italy, the heartland of the old empire, now ruled by the Ostrogoths. The dream was clean, simple, and glorious. Roman legions marching into Rome, restoring the Caesars. The reality was mud and blood, and a war that would drag on for nearly 20 years. We tend to think of the Goths as savage barbarians who destroyed Rome, but the kingdom Belisarius was sent to shatter was something else entirely. We know this because of the thousands of official documents they left behind. A collection called the Variae, compiled by a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus. These papers reveal a sophisticated, functioning state that had carefully preserved Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman infrastructure. This wasn't a land of savages, it was a hybrid kingdom, and it worked. Belisarius's invasion didn't liberate it. It broke it. The Gothic War was not a series of heroic field battles. It was a suffocating chain of brutal sieges. Cities like Rome, Milan, and Ravenna were besieged and rebesieged, their populations trapped inside, slowly turning into shadows haunting their own streets. Primary sources describe a level of suffering that official histories prefer to skip over. Starvation became the primary weapon. The great aqueducts of Rome were cut, silencing the city's fountains for the first time in centuries. People were reduced to eating dogs, mice, and boiled nettles. There are even darker rumors, whispered in the chronicles, of mothers eating their own children. For nearly 2 decades, the war ground on, turning the Garden of Italy into a graveyard. It was a Pyrrhic victory in the making, draining the empire's treasury and its manpower for a prize that was being destroyed in the process of its own conquest. But while Belisarius was bleeding the Goths in Italy, the empire's true enemy arrived. It didn't carry swords or banners. It traveled silently, in the blood of fleas on the backs of rats, aboard the grain ships that fed the golden capital. The grand armies of Belisarius, the impenetrable walls of Dara. They were all designed to fight a human enemy. They were useless against what came next. The invasion began in the year 541 AD at the port of Pelusium in Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire. It arrived on the grain ships, a microscopic stowaway on the fleas that infested the rats that swarmed in the cargo holds. This was the Justinianic plague, and it was a horror beyond the comprehension of the Roman mind. The eyewitness accounts, left by men like Procopius and a historian named Evagrius Scholasticus who caught it and survived, are not detached historical records. They are dispatches from hell. It began, Procopius says, with a gentle fever. But many victims first experienced hallucinations, seeing ghostly apparitions that warned them of their impending doom. Then the body would declare war on itself. Swellings the buboes would erupt in the groin, in the armpits, hard and black and filled with pus. From there, the disease took different paths. Some victims would fall into a deep, endless coma, wasting away without food or water. Others were seized by a violent madness, tormented by insomnia and delusions, throwing themselves from rooftops, their minds shattered long before their bodies gave out. Evagrius, who lost his wife and most of his children to it, described the sheer randomness of the killer. How some who tended to the sick and prayed for death were spared, while others who simply touched a victim's clothing would die instantly. For centuries, historians debated what this pestilence truly was, some even suggesting it was the first appearance of smallpox or measles. But within the last 50 years, a new kind of witness has come forward. Not a chronicler with parchment and ink, but a silent witness, found in the graves of the long dead. Forensic analysis of DNA extracted from the teeth of 6th century skeletons has given us the killer's name, Yersinia pestis, the very same bacterium that would return 800 years later as the Black Death. The nightmare had begun, and the greatest city in the world had no idea it was about to become an empire of the dead. The numbers are what truly break the mind. The battles of the Gothic War, which had bled the empire for years, killed thousands. The plague killed millions. Procopius, watching from within the city walls, made a horrifying claim. At its peak, the pestilence was taking 10,000 souls per day in Constantinople alone, an entire legion's worth of dead every 24 hours. Soon, the living could not keep up with the dead. The cemeteries overflowed. Civic functions simply ceased. When the pits were full, they began dumping the bodies into the sea, but they just washed back up on the shores. So they ripped the roofs off fortified towers and began stacking the bodies inside, layer upon layer, a silent, rotting garrison of the plague's victims. Picture this: a city of 500,000 people, and in a few short months, nearly half of them are gone. How does a civilization survive that? The truth is, it doesn't. Not really. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed Justinian's dream. Belisarius eventually returned from his endless war not to a triumphant, renewed Rome, but to a hollowed-out empire haunted by ghosts and ruled by a deeply paranoid emperor. Justinian, who had himself contracted and survived the plague, saw threats everywhere. His greatest general, a man of immense popularity and military might, was now the greatest threat of all. Belisarius was accused of conspiracy, his vast fortune seized. Now, the official records show he was eventually pardoned, but a much darker legend has echoed through history, more powerful than any official decree. A story of Belisarius, the conqueror of Africa and Italy, having his eyes put out on the emperor's order, reduced to a blind beggar on the streets of the very city he had saved, pleading, "Give a penny to old Belisarius." Whether it's literally true is almost irrelevant. The story survives because it reveals a deeper truth about the terrifying, corrosive nature of absolute power and the ultimate price of loyalty to a fearful king. Belisarius, the architect of that dream's military victories, came home not to a triumph, but to a court consumed by shadows. The plague had passed, but it left behind a disease of the mind in the emperor himself. Justinian, having faced his own mortality, was now enthroned in a fortress of paranoid suspicion. And in this new, fearful world, a subject's greatness is not a virtue. It is a threat. Belisarius, the hero of the people, the conqueror of 2 continents, was simply too popular, too powerful. The accusation came swiftly. Treason, a conspiracy to usurp the throne. The official record is cold and clinical. The great general was placed under house arrest, his vast fortune and properties seized by the state. And this is where the historical record ends and a much darker, more powerful legend begins. A story that has haunted the memory of the empire for 1,500 years. The story of Belisarius, his eyes gouged out by imperial order, cast out onto the streets of Constantinople. Imagine the scene. The man who had ridden in triumph through those same streets, now old and sightless, a cloak pulled over his ragged tunic, his hand outstretched, not for a sword, but for a coin, his voice pleading, "Give a penny to poor Belisarius." But is that what truly happened? The verifiable evidence says no. Records show Belisarius was eventually pardoned, his property restored, living out his final years in quiet dignity. The legend is almost certainly false, and yet it refuses to die. Why? Because some stories persist, not because they are factually true, but because they reveal a deeper truth. The legend of the blind general is the final, damning testimony on the nature of Justinian's rule. Even if the emperor didn't physically blind his greatest servant, he betrayed him. He humiliated him. He cast him into darkness. The legend is a visceral metaphor for the ultimate cost of serving absolute power. You give your life, your loyalty, your genius, and in the end, you can be disposed of like a broken tool. His personal war was over. But what of the grand imperial dream he had sacrificed everything for? What was the final body count of Justinian's ambition? So in the end, the dream was achieved. On paper, Justinian died in his bed an old man, and his maps showed an empire that once again stretched from the deserts of Persia to the Pillars of Hercules. The West was reconquered. The Renovatio imperii was complete. But it was a phantom, a magnificent corpse, The Hagia Sophia still stood, a testament to his soaring ambition, but it presided over a city of ghosts. The Italian peninsula was back in Roman hands, but it was a depopulated, shattered wasteland, scarred by 2 decades of relentless war. And both were haunted by the true conqueror of the age, an invisible tyrant you can only see under a microscope, Yersinia Pestis. The grand project had succeeded only in bankrupting the state, annihilating a generation of its men, and creating a vacuum of power that new enemies would eagerly fill in the coming centuries. Belisarius is the ghost that stands at the center of this tragic victory. Was he the last great Roman general, a final, brilliant flicker of classical glory before the long darkness of the Middle Ages? Or was he simply the most effective tool of a ruinous ambition? His story is a chilling forensic accounting of how the grand dreams of rulers are always paid for by the suffering of millions. It shows us that history is not just the story of great men and their great wars, but a story of infrastructure, of logistics, of disease, and of the terrifying power of microscopic forces that no army can ever hope to defeat. The final question, the one that echoes from the silent ruins and the mass graves of the 6th century, isn't just who Belisarius was, it's what his story warns us about power itself.